I knew the exact moment I stopped pretending. It wasn't when Clara reached across the white tablecloth and laced her fingers through mine in front of her entire family. It wasn't when her grandmother looked at me from the end of the table with those slow, knowing eyes and said, "I can tell he loves her. I've always been able to tell." It wasn't even when her ex-boyfriend walked into that restaurant, tall coat, expensive watch, new fiancé on his arm, and looked at me like I was a footnote in a story he thought he had already finished. The moment I stopped pretending was smaller than all of that. It was when Clara laughed. Not the careful laugh she had been using all evening, the one polished smooth like a river stone, the one she wore the way you wear something that covers what you don't want examined. It was the real one, the one that came out fast and surprised even her, the kind of laugh that makes a person cover her mouth afterward like she's accidentally let something loose she hadn't planned to release. She laughed at something I said about the bread basket, something unscripted, something that wasn't in any rehearsal we had run, and for one unguarded second she forgot to perform. And sitting there in the amber light of a restaurant I'd never been to before that night, I understood something I hadn't been prepared for. I would have said anything at all, just to hear that sound again. But none of this starts at a dinner table. It starts 8 months earlier, in a hallway on the 4th floor of an apartment building in Portland, Oregon, on a Tuesday night in October that smelled like rain through the elevator shaft, when a woman knocked on my door at 7:15 and said, without any introduction whatsoever, "I need to ask you something completely insane. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 31 years old. I work as a structural engineer, which means I spend my days calculating load tolerances and stress points in buildings that other people will live and work in, and I spend my evenings mostly alone, leftovers from whatever I made Sunday, documentary series about bridges, the occasional call with my mother who lives 3 states away and always leads with the same question, 'Are you eating properly?'" I had no plans that Tuesday. I had never had a plan that involved the woman from across the hall, but something about the way she was standing in my doorway, hands gripping the front of her overalls, chin lifted like she was bracing for rejection, eyes that were both tired and electrically alert, made me set down my fork and say, "Tell me." Her name was Clara Webb, 29, graphic designer, apartment 4B directly across from my 4A. We had the kind of relationship that 2 people can have for an entire year in a city building without it ever becoming anything more than civil acknowledgement. Nods at the mailboxes, a brief elevator conversation about the broken heat in January, one moment in the stairwell when she was carrying too many grocery bags and I held the door and she said thanks and I said sure, and that was the entirety of it. I knew she worked odd hours because her light was on past midnight more often than not. I knew she had a cat because I had heard her call for it through our shared wall in a voice that was entirely different from her hallway voice. Softer, a little embarrassed, like she was aware that someone might hear her baby talking to an animal and had decided not to care. I knew she smelled faintly of turpentine and something citrus when we passed on the stairs. That was everything. That was the whole of what I knew about Clara Webb when she appeared at my door and changed the inventory. She came inside. I offered water. She sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the glass and didn't drink from it. She told me the situation in about 5 minutes, with the tight efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing the speech on the elevator ride up and was now delivering it before she could lose her nerve. Her mother was coming to Portland for the weekend. Not just her mother, her Aunt Diane, who was sharp and suspicious and had strong opinions about everything from property taxes to appropriate dinner jacket lengths, and her grandmother Rose, who was 82 years old and had been asking, with the gentle persistence of a woman who has earned the right to ask anything, when Clara would find someone to be happy with. They had all planned a dinner for Sunday evening at Marcello's on 5th. The Italian place that required 6 weeks of advance reservation and where the bread came in a cloth-lined basket and the lighting made everyone look like they were in a different century. And the problem, the actual, structural problem, was this. Clara's mother, in what Clara described as a catastrophically casual phone call 3 days ago, had mentioned that she had also invited Daniel. Daniel was Clara's ex-boyfriend of 3 years. The one she had almost moved across the city with. The one who had ended things 14 months ago. The one who was now engaged. She'd seen it on a mutual friend's Instagram the week before, a ring photo captioned with 114 comments. To a woman named Priya, who would also be at Marcelo's on Sunday, with that ring on her finger and a smile Clara would have to sit across from for 2 hours. "My mother doesn't understand what she's done," Clara said. "She thinks we're all adults. She thinks we've moved on. She keeps saying Daniel was always family." She looked at her hands on the glass. "I just need someone there who looks like they chose me, because I cannot sit at that table across from him and his fiancé and have my grandmother ask me, in front of everyone, in her way that means nothing but kindness, why I'm still alone." She met my eyes. "I know this is an insane thing to ask a neighbor. I know you don't owe me anything. But you always seem calm and reasonable, and I'm a little desperate right now." I should have said no. Even in that moment I was aware I should say no. I was a man who calculated structural tolerances for a living. I was not an actor. I did not know this woman. I was the person she nodded at near the mailboxes. I said, "What would I need to know?" The relief on her face was quick and immediately covered. She nodded once, pulled a folded piece of paper from her overalls pocket. She had actually written notes, and we went through it. Her mother's name was Susan. Warm, overwhelming, asked too many questions and meant well by every one. Aunt Diane was harder. Attentive the way a watchmaker is attentive, looking for imprecision. Grandma Rose was, in Clara's words, the most genuinely kind person I have ever met. Which makes it worse because when she asks about your life she means it, and there is no armor against sincerity. I needed to know that Clara and I had supposedly met at the coffee shop around the corner 6 months ago. I had spilled my coffee, she had laughed, we had talked for 2 hours. I needed to know we had been together 5 months, that it was serious but quiet, that Clara didn't like to rush things, which was true regardless of any fiction. I needed to know the cat's name was Pixel, not something that rhymed with it, and that I was mildly allergic but managed because I liked being at her place. I needed to know she hated mushrooms. I listened to all of it. I took mental notes the same way I cataloged load data on a project file. Organized, sequential, flagged for retrieval. And somewhere around the mushrooms I noticed something that I did not immediately analyze. I was enjoying this. Not the deception or the stakes or the chance that everything could go sideways in a restaurant that required 6 weeks' notice. The conversation, the way she talked with her hands when she was nervous, the gestures slightly ahead of the words, like her hands were trying to get there first. The way she caught herself mid-tangent and said, "Sorry, I'm giving you too much." The way she looked at me while she was briefing me, with the same expression a person uses when they're not sure what they're looking at but haven't looked away yet. "Why me?" I asked when she paused. She considered it honestly. "Because you've never been rude to me. That sounds like a low bar, but you'd be surprised." A pause. "And because if I asked someone I actually knew, they'd have opinions. You're just across the hall. You're neutral." I should have felt like a piece of furniture she was borrowing. Instead I said, "Okay, I'll do it." We met 3 more times before Sunday. Twice for coffee in her apartment. Pixel studied me from the arm of the couch with the professional skepticism of a cat who has seen people come and go, and once for a long walk along the river where she quizzed me on family names and I asked her questions she hadn't prepared for. What music did she play on long drives? What did she order when she was sad? When was the last time something genuinely surprised her? She told me to stop over-preparing. I told her that under-preparation was how buildings fell down. She rolled her eyes and answered anyway. What I learned about Clara Webb in those 4 days: she drove in silence on long trips because she thought best without music, then turned it on loud for the final 20 minutes as a reward to herself. She ordered grilled cheese when she was sad because her father used to make it for her on school mornings when she was having a hard week. Her father had died 4 years ago, and she still hadn't learned the graceful way to mention it in conversation, so she usually just didn't. The last thing that had genuinely surprised her was a letter from an old university professor, completely out of nowhere, telling her that a poster she had designed for a student exhibition 10 years ago had been selected for a permanent institutional display. She had cried about it in a coffee shop and pretended to be reading something sad on her phone so no one would ask. I filed all of it. Every detail. On Sunday evening, I put on the charcoal blazer I wore to professional presentations and the dark jeans that were the dressiest jeans I owned and knocked on her door at 6:15. When she opened it, I did something involuntary with my face that I immediately corrected. She was wearing a deep green dress that ended at the knee, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, small silver earrings catching the hallway light. She looked at me and said, "You look presentable." I said, "You look terrifying." The laugh that came out was fast and uncalculated. She pulled the door shut behind her. "Let's go," she said. Marcello's smelled like garlic and candle wax, and the specific prosperity that makes you straighten your posture when you walk through the door. Susan was already at the table when we arrived. A warmer, softer version of Clara with the same eyes and the same tendency to speak slightly before she had finished deciding what to say. She stood when she saw us and said, "Oh, Clara, look at you," in the layered way that mothers say things that mean 100 things simultaneously. Aunt Diane was seated beside her. Mid-60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a smile that arrived a half-beat after the rest of her expression, considered and deliberate. She looked at me the way a customs officer looks at a passport. Not hostile, but complete. Grandma Rose was at the end of the table. Small, upright, white hair pinned neatly, wearing a blue cardigan with a small silver brooch shaped like a bird at the lapel. She had the particular stillness that belongs to people who have lived long enough to stop wasting movement. When she looked at me, she didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked. Then, "Sit down, dear. I want to hear about you." I sat. For the first 40 minutes, everything went according to the briefing. I answered Susan's questions about engineering with enough specificity to seem genuine and not so much that it felt rehearsed. I deferred to Clara on questions about our relationship in the natural way that two people defer when they have actually talked about something. When Aunt Diane asked how I had known things were serious, I said, she remembered something I'd mentioned in passing about 3 weeks later and treated it like it still mattered. I thought, that's someone who actually listens. Clara looked at me quickly. I hadn't planned that. It came out because it was true. She had done exactly that, twice, in our 4 days of preparation sessions, and I had noticed both times. Grandma Rose watched all of it from the end of the table and said very little. Then Daniel walked in. He was taller than I had imagined. Not dramatically, just tall enough to fill a doorway in a way that announced him. Dark coat, a watch that caught the restaurant light before his face did, the easy confidence of a person who has not spent much time being uncertain. Priya was beside him, beautiful, genuinely warm-faced, visibly nervous in a way that made me immediately sympathetic toward her. She had nothing to do with any of this and was clearly doing her best. She was wearing a wine-colored dress and holding Daniel's arm with the careful grip of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Daniel came to the table and kissed Susan's cheek and said her name warmly. He greeted Aunt Diane, and then he found Clara. "Hey you," he said. "You look great." 2 seconds of quiet that lasted longer from the inside. Then he looked at me. "I don't think we've met." Easy, assessing. Clara said my name before I could. "Jake. My fiancé." She had said the word before, in our rehearsals, twice while walking by the river, once at the coffee counter while ordering, just to practice saying it without her jaw visibly tightening. She had said it carefully and deliberately each time, like a note she was training herself to hit, but she'd never said it like that, quietly, matter-of-factly, as if it were simply part of her permanent vocabulary. Daniel's face adjusted so quickly you'd have missed it if you weren't watching specifically for it. Then the smile returned. "That's wonderful. Congratulations." We shook hands. I registered nothing unusual in the grip. He was not a bad person. I could see that clearly enough. He was just a person who had made a choice 14 months ago and was now standing in front of the evidence of what that choice had cost someone who hadn't deserved it. They sat across from us, Daniel and Priya, and the dinner continued. Susan moved conversation with the practiced effort of a woman who has been the engine of many gatherings. The menus came and went. At some point I reached for the breadbasket at the same moment as Clara, and her hand landed on mine, and neither of us moved for just slightly longer than the situation required. She pulled away first. I looked at the menu. The moment I almost broke was when Aunt Deanne looked directly at me and said, "So, Jake, how long do you intend to let things drift before making this properly official?" And there was 1 second where I had to reorient before remembering that we were already the engaged ones and she was asking about a wedding. I said, "I think Clara sets the pace on anything that matters. I just try to keep up." And from beside me came a small sound that Clara was converting into something more neutral, unsuccessfully. Grandma Rose continued to watch. Around the time the pasta arrived, Priya asked Clara something genuine about graphic design, something curious and specific, and they fell into a conversation that was entirely real and entirely had nothing to do with the surrounding architecture of history and tension. I watched Clara talk, the hands moving again, the slight forward lean that appeared when she was actually engaged with something and not performing engagement, the way she shook her head at one point and said, "No, that's exactly wrong, and I'll tell you why," with the soft conviction of someone who has spent years knowing something thoroughly. I thought about 8 months of hallway nods, about how long 12 feet can be when you aren't paying attention. Then Daniel said something. Not to the table. To me quietly, while Priya and Clara talked and Susan was asking the waiter something about the dessert menu. He said it almost conversationally, the way people say things they've decided to dress as concern. She deserves someone who's actually present for her. Clara always needed more attention than one person could really give. He said it like a warning, like a favor. I looked at him. I kept my voice at the same register as the restaurant. "That's interesting," I said. "Because from where I'm sitting, she's not difficult to pay attention to. She's pretty easy to understand, actually. You just have to show up and listen." 3 seconds of quiet between us. Then Priya said something that pulled Clara's attention back, and the moment dissolved. Clara hadn't heard the exchange, but she must have sensed something shift in the air around me, because a moment later she reached under the table and placed her hand over mine on my knee. Not for show. There was no audience for the gesture from that angle, just a hand, light and deliberate, that said, "I see you." And then, from the far end of the table, Grandma Rose looked at me and smiled. Not the polite dinner smile, the other kind. The kind that said she had followed the whole thing from 12 feet away and had an opinion about it. After the main course, I excused myself to find the restroom. I stood at the sink running cold water over the inside of my wrists, something I do when I need to recalibrate, which is not as strange as it sounds when you have the kind of job where precision matters and small errors propagate. And the door opened. I expected staff. It was Grandma Rose. She moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who has stopped borrowing time from anyone. She stood beside me at the sink, looked at my reflection in the mirror for a moment, and said, "I'm not going to pretend I don't notice things." I turned off the water. I didn't say anything. I notice when a young man looks at my granddaughter like she's something he has been trying to find the right word for and just found it. She touched the bird brooch at her lapel briefly. An old habit, I thought, a talisman. And I notice when she's pretending not to look back at him the same way. I looked at the mirror. Rose looked at my reflection in it. "I don't need the whole story," she said. "At 82 I've learned that the whole story usually arrives on its own timeline and I am not obligated to wait for it." She placed one hand on my arm, twice, the way grandmothers do when they have delivered everything they came to deliver. "Just don't waste the rest of the evening." She walked out. I stood at that sink for about 20 seconds longer than I needed to. I thought about load-bearing walls, about yield points, the specific moment in structural engineering where the pressure applied to a material exceeds what the material can hold elastically, and the structure begins to change permanently. Not collapse, change. Something that was rigid becoming something that has been altered by what it carried. I thought about this for longer than was probably reasonable in a restaurant bathroom. Then I went back to the table. Dessert arrived the way restaurant desserts do at the end of complicated evenings. Slightly too sweet, slightly generous, and welcome regardless. Tiramisu in small glasses. A cannoli plate for sharing. Clara had told me 3 days ago during a walk by the river that panna cotta was the only dessert she considered non-negotiable at Italian restaurants. When the waiter came to take dessert orders, I said, before looking at the menu, "And the panna cotta for her." The waiter noted it and moved on. Clara turned to look at me. "You remembered that," she said, not a question. Said very quietly, almost to herself, in the way you say something that belongs to a different category than the words suggest. "You told me." I shrugged. Tried to make it small. Leave it in the practical space where it could be safely filed. She didn't look away. The light in Marcello's was warm and without sharp edges. The kind of light that photographs well in memory, the amber that makes everything look like it happened on purpose. In that light, I watched something happen in Clara's face. Not a sudden thing, more like a thing that had been happening gradually all evening and only now became visible from the outside. The careful brightness she had worn since we walked in dropped a half-inch. Her shoulders, the set of her jaw, the performance that had been holding everything tidy since we stepped out of the elevator at her building. "Jake," she said. "Yeah?" She looked at the tablecloth for a moment. Then back at me. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to decide right now whether you're still doing me a favor or whether you're somewhere else." I kept my face still. My chest was doing something specific that I was actively not analyzing. "I'm listening," she exhaled once, very quietly. I don't remember the last time someone ordered for me because they actually paid attention to what I said. Not to score a point, not to seem impressive, just because they heard me. Her voice was low and completely unperformed. "That's a small thing. I know it's a small thing. And I also know that it's the kind of small thing that is actually not small at all." I thought about what Grandma Rose had said in the bathroom. I thought about Daniel telling me Clara always needed more attention than one person could give, and how precisely, completely wrong I believed that was. I thought about 4 days of preparation sessions that had somehow become 4 days of actually knowing someone. The late-night grilled cheese, the professor's letter, the music turned up loud for the last 20 minutes of a long drive. I thought about 8 months of hallway nods, and what had been on the other side of a wall I had never once knocked on. I said, "I stopped doing you a favor about 3 hours ago." She was quiet. "I don't know exactly when," I said. "Somewhere between Aunt Diane asking me to define serious and your grandmother making me feel like she had X-ray vision pointed specifically at me." I turned my water glass on the table. Once, twice, an old habit. But I'm not pretending anymore. I haven't been for a while. The restaurant hummed along at the edges of the moment the way background sound does when you've stopped hearing it. The low murmur of other tables' conversations, the faint clink of glasses, the soft string music from somewhere unseen. Clara looked at me for a long time. "This is so inconvenient," she said finally, quietly, with something that wasn't quite a smile but was heading toward one. "I know. We're at a dinner I invented. I know that too. And my grandmother is absolutely looking at us right now. I didn't turn to check. I believe you." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Then it became a real one. Not the full, unguarded version, but close to it, one that she caught halfway and held. "What do we do with this?" "I don't know," I said, "but I'd like to find out. If that's something you want." She looked at the panna cotta when it arrived, set on the table in front of her by a waiter who read the room and said nothing extra. She picked up her spoon, turned it in her hand once, set it down, and then she looked at me the same way she had looked at me in my doorway on a Tuesday in October when she had asked for something she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. "I want that," she said. We stayed another half hour after dessert. Long enough for Susan to cry a little at the goodbyes, which I hadn't anticipated, and to hug me with the unself-conscious warmth of a woman who makes decisions about people quickly and commits to them. Aunt Diane shook my hand and said, "You'll do," in a tone I chose to receive as the high praise it probably was in her vocabulary. Daniel and Priya said their goodbyes first, quietly, and when Daniel passed me near the coats, he didn't say anything. He gave me one nod, small, complete, and I nodded back and let it be what it was. Grandma Rose was last. She took my face in both her hands the way you can only do when you're 82 and have stopped having patience for the long route to sincerity. She held it for a moment and looked at me with eyes that were clear and unhurried and entirely without performance. "Be good to her," she said. "She's been carrying everything alone for too long." "I know," I said. "No," she said gently. "You don't yet. But you will." She kissed my cheek and walked away with Susan, the two of them moving toward the exit with the unhurried pace of women who have seen enough of life to stop rushing the parts worth savoring. Clara and I stepped out into the cool night air. The street was wet from an earlier rain neither of us had noticed while inside. The restaurant light caught the puddles in long amber reflections. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment without speaking, and the city moved around us in its indifferent, continuous way. Traffic, and voices, and the distant rhythm of a neighborhood doing what neighborhoods do on Sunday evenings. "I owe you dinner," she said. "You just took me to dinner. A real one. One I don't write notes for first." I looked at her. The silver earrings, the green dress. Something different in her face from when we'd arrived, not exactly relaxed, but less constructed, like something she had been carrying all evening had been set down somewhere inside the restaurant, and she had walked out without picking it back up. "Okay," I said, "but you're paying. You ordered the panna cotta without being asked, which means you owe me more, not less." She laughed, the real one, the one from the breadbasket. Except this time she didn't cover her mouth. She just let it happen, standing there on a wet sidewalk in front of a restaurant with a 6-week waiting list, and it hit the night air like something clean and unguarded and entirely hers. We walked home. 12 blocks, which neither of us suggested shortening. The night was cold enough for coat pockets and quiet enough for the kind of conversation that doesn't have a destination, that covers the architecture of the buildings we passed, a story about her first freelance client who had wanted everything redesigned in a shade he described only as confident beige, a building on 7th that I identified by its structural system out loud, for which she called me deeply unromantic, for which I pointed out that she had a cat named after a camera sensor and was therefore not qualified to assign personality flaws. By the time we reached our building, we had talked for 12 blocks without running out of things to say, which is a specific and reliable piece of information about two people. We stopped at the elevator. It was working for once. She pressed 4. We rode up in the particular quiet of an elevator at the end of a long evening, the kind of quiet that has weight without being uncomfortable. The doors opened onto the 4th floor, and we walked the 10 steps to the twin doors of 4A and 4B, and we stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight. You already thanked me downstairs. I'm thanking you again. Clara." She looked at me. "Ask me to come in for coffee," I said. "Not because you need anything. Just because you want to." She was quiet for a moment. The hallway held its particular late Sunday sound, a television from somewhere below, the low hum of the building doing its job, the faint tick of the radiator that had been promising to be fixed since January. "I want to," she said. She opened the door. Pixel appeared immediately, suspicious in the specific professional way of cats who have assessed a new person and not yet decided how to file them. I sneezed once and recovered. Clara made coffee in a kitchen I had heard through the wall for 8 months and never seen, and it turned out she made it strong enough to be structural, which I respected. We sat on her couch, she cross-legged, facing me, I with my feet on the floor, and the conversation stopped being about nothing and started being about something. I told her that I'd heard her call for Pixel through the wall on multiple occasions, and had spent 3 months wondering if that was the actual name or a nickname for something more formal. She told me she had borrowed my umbrella in February. She had left a note, she said immediately and defensively. I said I had never found it, on a morning when she was already running late and her own umbrella was inexplicably in someone else's car. We had been 12 feet apart, separated by drywall and a shared understanding that neighbors in this city don't push past a certain layer of proximity, and she had borrowed my umbrella in February, and I had walked to the train that day in the rain and never known. "I think I owe you an umbrella," she said. "I think we're well past the umbrella," I said. She smiled. Not the polished version. The quiet, unperformed one that lived underneath. The one I had now seen enough times to recognize as the real architecture of her face. The one that the performance was built on top of. The one that had been there all along. 12 feet across a hallway, behind a door I had nodded at for 8 months without understanding what I was standing next to. I left at midnight. I didn't stay longer, not because I wanted to go, but because some things grow better when you give them the right conditions instead of rushing them. And I had spent 4 days learning that this was worth growing carefully. At the door, she walked me to the hallway and stood between our 2 apartments in the particular quiet of a building after midnight. And she said, simply, "I'm glad you said yes." I looked at her in the hallway light. So am I. In the morning, there was a note under my door. Not a sticky note, actual paper, torn from a sketchbook, her handwriting looping and precise at the same time. It said, "Tuesday, real dinner, no prep required. Also, I found your umbrella, it's been in my closet this whole time. I'm sorry about that." I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of the charcoal blazer hanging on the hook behind the door, the one that still held, faintly, the warmth of a restaurant that required a 6-week reservation and an evening I had walked into as a placeholder and walked out of as something I did not yet have the right word for. I had gone to that dinner as a favor to a neighbor I barely knew. I had arrived with a rehearsed backstory and a borrowed role and a plan for making it through 2 hours without incident. And somewhere between the breadbasket and the panna cotta and an 82-year-old woman who looked at me in a restaurant bathroom and said, "Don't waste the rest of the evening," the role had stopped being a role and the story had stopped being borrowed. Something that had been rigid became something permanently changed by what it had been asked to carry. If you have ever agreed to something small because the alternative was going home to leftovers and a quiet apartment, and found yourself on the other side of it looking at your life differently, you understand exactly where the next part of this story begins. Not with a plan, not with a grand gesture or a perfectly timed speech, just with a note slid under a door on a Monday morning, and a folded piece of paper in a jacket pocket, and the very clear, uncomplicated knowledge that Tuesday could not arrive fast enough.